Hi, I'm Professor Green, and today we're going to be talking about Chapter 4, Internal Analysis, Resources, Capabilities, and Core Competencies. So I'm excited to deep dive into this because we've been talking a lot about external analyses and industry analyses and what's going on in the environment and why we'll continue to consider this. We really want to talk about now what's happening within the firm um, and focusing a lot on what exactly are the core competencies, what the definition is, and how a company can identify them. So, the learning objectives for this chapter are first explaining why and how internal firm differences are the root of competitive advantage. And so, right, how one company is different from the other. And yeah, so really understanding, what makes one company special. Then we're going to differentiate among firms, core competencies, their resources, capabilities, and activities. So there are like three or four different key pieces in there that we're going to deep dive on. And really understanding what it means by resources. What does it mean by capabilities? What can they do? And what are the activities? What do they do every day? Next, we're going to look at comparing and contrasting tangible and intangible resources. Tangible being like brick and mortar, things you can touch and feel, and intangible being company culture, and how they do things around there, the whole organizational behavior piece. And I don't know if you knew this or not, but the intangible resources are typically much higher in value than the tangible ones. We're going to also evaluate learning objective number 4, the two critical assumptions about the nature of resources in the resource-based view. So this whole idea about looking at a company from the view of what their resources are. And there's a very important scholar from the University of Utah. He went to Yale for his PhD, and he's going to talk to us about that, or he's going to tell us about it in the book. And in class, I'll hopefully show you a video about him. Next is the VRIO framework. So again, looking at resources, but we're looking at now from the competitive implications. So can the company have can it be imitated quite easily, right? What is happening with their competitors, and so how do we look at resources from that perspective? Learning outcome 6, evaluating different conditions. So to allow a firm to sustain a competitive advantage, and that's the whole idea, right? How can we continue to sustain a competitive advantage, and what can happen in the world that can help us or hurt us? We're going to outline how dynamic capabilities let it for. Oh, I already. Yeah. Let the firm sustain a competitive advantage. So right, these dynamic is a lot about this chapter is a lot about looking at how things will continuously change in the world, right? New technologies, world events, the pandemics, etc., and how a company needs to adapt to those changes and how well it can adapt will help predict how successful it can be. Learning objective number 8, applying a value chain analysis. So this is really fun because this kind of starts to get us into the details of operations and research and development and things like this. And so that's my personal perspective that I was always in operations. And I think there's so much value that can come to a firm from this point of view, from this area within the firm. So this value chain analysis helps us understand which of these activities are transforming input into outputs, uh, right? And so again, what's creating value, and then what's creating it simply cost, and what's creating a combination of the two. Then identifying competitive advantage as residing in a network of distinct activities. And so again, as I said, this chapter is all about competitive advantage, how we can hold on to it. And so understanding here that it's not we're not working in silos, right? That it is a network. There are lots of different people working with lots of different organizations and lots of different people, employees, etc. More into like an extension of stakeholder theory. And then lastly, conducting a SWOT analysis to generate insights. You're going to use this in your client projects from external and internal analyses and to derive strategic implications. So shifting from, as I mentioned earlier today, an external to an internal analysis of a firm. So we want to formulate a strategy that leads to a sustainable competitive advantage. And you'll probably hear me say that probably 10 or 15 times before this chapter is over. Let me set a timer here so that I don't go over. And so resources and capabilities, right, must combine to form competitive core competencies. So what do they have? What can they do? And they should consciously work to identify these. And so if you're starting a business, a big key part is understanding how do you bring value? How do you bring value the best among your competitors? What is the top thing that you do? And that we should evaluate this. We're going to look at an exhibit here in just a minute, in the context of your pestle. So what's happening in the political and economic arena, et cetera. You should also look at it using Porter's five forces, which we looked at earlier, which is all about the industry, what's happening in your industry. And besides that, going deeper and looking at it in your strategic group map, if you remember from previous chapters, that you can be in the same industry, just like the airline industry, but then you can be in a different strategic group. So like Southwest is a low cost airline, so that's but it's in the same industry as American Airlines, but it's not in the same strategic group, right? JetBlue is in the same strategic group because they are trying to still move forward with a low cost model. And so here's that lovely exhibit 4.2. And you've seen this before, the pestle, right? And I'm reminding you again here, here's the industry, and then here's the strategic group within the industry. And this is what we're focusing on in this chapter. Inside the firm, we're talking about what is the firm's core competencies, resources, and their capabilities, right? What can they do and how do they do it? And so, the internal firm differences help lead to their competitive advantage. Like, what are they doing differently, right? What is Samsung doing differently from Apple, right? That all happens inside, and that then leads to some competitive advantage. And those strengths, as I said, should be dynamic because the external environment is always changing, right? One day from to the next, if you can just think about semiconductors, right? Today we sit with one version of semiconductors, but next week there's going to be another version. AI is evolving, et cetera. And then we want to think about strategically fit within the environment. And we're going to spend a few slides here talking about resources, capabilities, and competencies. And the whole idea here is that we want to match these things within the organization to the external environment. So you want to exploit opportunities and reduce your threats and reduce your weaknesses. And so, what are core competencies? These are really unique strengths, right? What does LMU do well, right? We do really well social justice. We do really well living in Los Angeles and having a mission-based university. And so core competencies also embedded deep within a firm, right? I always read on these online blogs of students looking at LMU, right? They tell you right away when you're on a tour, this is a Catholic university, 100%. It is deep within our organization. It allows the firm to differentiate from their rivals, right? So we are different from UCLA, we're different from USC, we're also different from Gonzaga, right? Or Georgetown, right? Because we're positioned here in Los Angeles. This results in creating higher value for the customer, or it results in products or services offered at a lower cost. So we are not a low cost university, but we, in theory, are providing a higher value because we are a Catholic institution. That students come away from this education experience with a sense of moral grounding. And this is expressed through the structures, the processes, and the routines. And they also talk about this in the Five Guys case, right? That these customized hamburgers, they spend so much time, years, decades almost perfecting these structures, these processes, and these routines. And so we're going to look at another exhibit in two slides. And again, a deep dive into what are structures and processes, routines, etc. Here's some examples of core competencies. Five Guys, right? They offer the highest quality ingredients, free toppings. I think that's so interesting. A simple menu. They choose not to have drive-throughs or an expanded menu, especially living here in LA, and having a small child. I really look for the drive-throughs, but they say they're not going there. Apple, their core competency is superior industrial design, right? Integrating hardware and software. Tesla vertically integrated car manufacturing. So they create the whole car from finish to end, and it's a clean tech company. And Netflix, right? AI to creating best-in-class personalized recommendation algorithm. And so here's that really great exhibit, 4.4. So this is linking core competencies, the resources, and the capabilities to the activities. So together, the resources and the capabilities help create those core competencies. The resources reinforce the core competencies. The capabilities are orchestrate the core competencies. And then together they leverage these activities, like what is done every day within the organization. And together that creates your competitive advantage. And they have these dotted lines going back because you always want to reinvest, hone, and upgrade, right? Because the external environment, again, is always changing. And so you really need to adapt as you go. The example that they mentioned here in the textbook, they talked a lot about Yeti and doing this high-end camping gear, which I thought was so cool because it's become so popular in the last 10 years. And the whole idea, right, that it's like core competency, it's like this very durable, high-end, tough, if you return it, they'll replace it type of idea. And so they have this capability to create those, they orchestrate that, they have the resources, the people who understand what that camping gear needs to be, and then they leverage that. So they have all these activities to create thermoses, mugs, different things, and then that creates their competitive advantage. And as you can see, they've really established themselves in the market that when you go out to look for like a really top quality item for camping, you're going to look for Yeti first. And so let's keep going. Organizations, they did, this helps organizations develop their core competencies through resources, capabilities, activities, as I mentioned. And so, again, resources are any asset that the firm can draw upon when crafting and executing strategy. This is cash, building, machinery, intellectual property. So for Yeti, right? They made that amazing cooler that is really durable. That they have that picture in the textbook of the guy or the piece of plywood and standing on that. Well, obviously, they don't have plywood anymore, but they patented these ideas of these really durable products. Then we have the capabilities. So these are the organizational management skills. This is what I'm training you to do, right? To create value for the organization that you join. And this then you orchestrate those resources, right? Then you know better how to manage the people and the machines and the cash, etc. And this comes through structure, routines, and culture, right? Whether you work in human resources or accounting, etc. And then we have the activities here. These are distinct and fine-grained business processes, order taking, invoices, and et cetera. And so we're going to talk in the next slide a little bit more about resources. And so this is again now, as I said, deep diving with the resource-based view. This is identifying how to identify core competencies. So they're key to superior firm performance. So, right, you need to identify these. If you're going to do well, you really need to understand very well what you do well. And resources, as we said, are assets, capabilities, competencies. And they fall into two categories, tangible and intangible. As I mentioned at the beginning of this section of this chapter, that tangible have physical attributes like brick and mortar buildings, and intangible, they don't have anything. Let me hop on to the next slide because I love this exhibit here. So intangible are like culture, knowledge, as I mentioned, human resources, organizational behavior ideas, managing people, brand equity, reputation, and intellectual property as well. Really huge investments that a company makes. And that traditionally, there's much more value in these intangible resources than they are in the tangible ones. An example that they give in the book is about Google. and how it's located in Silicon Valley and how that is an intangible asset because they have access to top talent that come out of Stanford and Berkeley, et cetera. And they also have access to capital companies, which, way back when Google did get funding from Sequoia Capital and a couple of the big names. And so they're in these circles. And so they decide not to leave Silicon Valley because there is so much value in being close to these other organizations. And so, coming back to the theory here, there are two critical assumptions of the resource-based view. Um, and so we just need to understand that when we look at this view of looking at, honing in on what the resources are, we just need to understand that we're assuming a few things. The first thing is that there's heterogeneity. So it means that a firm is a unique bundle of resources, capabilities, and competencies. So that's not necessarily always true that they are unique, but in this instance, to move through these ideas, we're going to just assume that they are, and that these bundles differ across different firms. So you can't have two firms that have the same bundle of resources. And so the example that they give in the book here is Southwest Airlines and Alaska Airlines. And that while, yes, they are in the same strategic group, right? They're both low cost airlines. Um, that their human resources theories differ, right? And that at Southwest Airlines, employees really can do anything. Pilots end up loading luggage, airline attendants end up cleaning, but Alaska doesn't do it that way. They have specific people for specific jobs, which is more traditional for the airline industry. But Southwest has decided to move with a different model, and it seems to be working for them. And that because of that, Southwest can really save money because they don't have anybody who's like sitting down at any point in time during the workday. They can always be doing something. And before I hop on to resource immobility, I also want to say that, these intangible assets, most often the competitive advantage shows up there. So that's why we don't focus so much on the tangible assets, the land, capital, the equipment, the supplies, things like this. There is value in that too, but mostly it comes from the intangible ones where there's no physical attribute. And so coming back to resources, the resource-based view, here we have resource immobility. And again, this is another assumption that the resources are not sticky and that they can't move easily from firm to firm. Their resources are difficult to replicate, and that resources can last for a long time. And so again, that is not the perfect world, that sometimes they can be easily moved from firm to firm or they don't last for a long time, but that's we're gonna roll with this for now. The example that they give in the book is about Delta and how they attempted to copy Southwest. Um, and they had a couple different things that they were trying to do, but it didn't work for them because they had a different culture and they just set up things differently, kind of like how Alaska, had to copy things that Southwest is doing because they just have a different organization in general. And so let's move on to the VRIO framework. And so VR, valuable, rare, costly to imitate, and then organized to capture the value of the resource. And so Dr. Jay Barney, he is from Northern California. If you are from the East Bay, he's from Walnut Creek. He got his PhD at Yale. He's not that old. He's like in his early 70s at the moment. And now he teaches at the University of Utah after teaching at UCLA and a couple of other different universities. So I want to say that he's just a modern economist and theorist, business theorist. And what he teaches is strategic management. And so he came up with this framework saying that it's a tool for evaluating the firm resource endowments. What do they have? Endowments is another word for like what you have, what you own. And when it comes to resources. So what resource attributes underpin competitive advantage? And so helping companies identify, how can they be successful in the future? Well, one of the things that they can do is look at their resources and really identify what their competitive advantage is. And so let's keep talking about the VRIO framework. Here it gives us a little flow chart So, and this flow chart could be a really great opportunity for you to put into your client projects and help the client understand, are you moving towards, are they moving towards competitive advantage? And so, first thing is the resource, capability, or competency valuable? Right? If it is, um, great, then we move on to rare. If it's not valuable, then you're moving in a direction of competitive disadvantage, right? So again, looking at the yoga brand or something, are the yoga clothing, is it valuable to someone? Hopefully, yes. If not, then you're not going to be competitive. You're not going to have a competitive advantage. Is it rare? And so again, for the yoga clothing, they really have to identify, is this rare? Because there's so many yoga brands out there, but is this a different brand where they have different designs or they have different quality or they have a different sustainable supply chain methods? So if it's not rare, then there's comparative parity, right? Then then there's going to be more competition because there's going to be somebody else competing for the same. Is it exclusive? Comparative parity, I think if another way to say that is exclusive, is it unique? If it is rare, then can it be imitated easily? And so if the imitation is costly, great. And so that's where we start to talk about Apple or Samsung. Yeah, it is really hard to imitate those products, 100%. Yoga clothing, unfortunately, it is pretty easy to imitate. So then you might have a temporary competitive advantage, something that you need to resolve. That you might have competitive advantage, but only for a short time until somebody goes out and imitates your product. But if it is costly to be imitated, like Apple products, is the firm organized to capture value? So again, this is again where I worked in operation, right? Was this organization set up to move forward and produce product and actually, continue into the future? And so if it's yes, then you have sustainable competitive advantage. If you don't, there's just temporary competitive advantage. They'll be making little clothing for next week or next month, but if you don't have an organization that is organized to continue, then you're going to run into a problem. So a resource is valuable. Going back to the VRIO framework, right? How do you decide if it's valuable? It helps to exploit an opportunity, right? Does it just increase value? Is it rare? Um, Only if one or few firms possess it, right? So again, yoga clothing, is this yoga love product really rare? We are going to find out this semester. Is it costly to imitate? Competitors cannot develop or buy the resource at a reasonable price. Imitation and substitution are risks, 100%, right? And so, going back to Five Guys, the supply chain was really hard to imitate because they spent decades, making sure they had the right potatoes, and making sure that it was fresh, making sure that they have access to all these amazing things that they can choose from. Also Crocs, they went sideways, right? They had an amazing product, and even though they had a patent, it was still easy to imitate. And unfortunately, they have not done so well because there's so many products out there that are so similar. And the last thing is the firm organized to capture value through effective internal organizational structure and coordinating systems. And so, yeah, the example here also that they give is Groupon. That Groupon did great. It was valuable, 100%. They brought together group coupons and they got people together to buy in bulk in their local community. And then they made these deals with these local vendors or sellers or, people who are making product or services, and it was great. But they should have taken the deal to sell way back when because unfortunately it was easily imitated, and that many people came on and decided to come up with the same idea, and that their idea was based mostly on human labor to seek out the deals. So I was there. I didn't work for Groupon directly, but I was a vendor. I was selling yoga retreats at the time, and so I was working with Groupon to sell those yoga retreats. It was super successful. It worked out really well and really for us and for them. But it is very local, right? And there are so many competitors that came onto the market. I was doing this again in Switzerland, and I worked with a company called Dein Deal, Your Deal in German. And yeah, unfortunately, Groupon, even though it exists, it is not a unique product any longer. And so let's do isolating mechanisms, and then we'll take a break. So, looking at isolating mechanisms, this is all about barriers to imitation. So, how can an organization sustain their competitive advantage by preventing rivals or competitors from competing away their advantage? So, the first thing is they can engage with better expectations of future resource value. So, the example they give here is a land developer. If they buy cheaper land or seek out the cheaper land that they know that will then appreciate, and then they can either sell it or they can rent it out. That's a great way of sustaining your competitive advantage is like, looking to the future as to what the value will be in the future. The next thing is path dependence, where past decisions limit current options. And so, yeah, this is how, yeah, past decisions. The example that they give in the book is about Georgia and the carpet factories, actually. And so one town in Georgia is responsible for like 80% of all the carpet that's produced in the United States. It's because they have like set up the system and the suppliers and access to the materials and the talent who know about producing carpet. And so, yeah, super interesting how, yeah, unless you're setting up a space in Georgia to create carpet, you don't really have a lot of opportunity for success. And so, yeah. And then the next one is casual ambiguity, cause and effect, or can be vague. And this I think is interesting because it comes down to Apple. So we look at Apple and we say, like, why is it so successful? There's so many cases, business cases about it. But was it Steve Jobs? Was it, the research, or was it the Tim Cook now? Is it this, the supply chain, et cetera? There's so many different factors that go into why Apple. And so no other company can really produce it because there's so many different things that they do well. And so that cause and effect are kind of vague, they kind of intertwine. The next one is social complexity, where social and business systems interact. And this is super interesting. They compared Zappos with a financial services company, like a bank. And like Zappos, while it's like a very flat organization, and the people get like a lot of freedom to kind of tell the customer whatever it is that they want. That would not work in the banking industry. In banking, we need things to be a lot more structured and a traditional hierarchy so that people know like where to go in different directions. And then the last thing is the intellectual property protection. And so this is usually like a 20-year period where the patents exist. And so we talk about, competitive advantage of organizations like pharmaceuticals or technology companies that have some sort of IP protection. So let me go ahead and stop there before I get into core rigidity. This is part one of two sections of chapter 4.